They called us observers. That was the official designation assigned by the Interstellar Research Commission when our program was first established, 312 years ago by the human calendar, though of course at the time we had no idea what a human calendar was. We barely knew what a human was. The species had been catalogued only recently, flagged by one of our long-range survey drones as it swept through the outer edges of the Milky Way, a galaxy we had been mapping for the better part of 2,000 years. The drone's report was 11 pages long. 6 of those pages were photographs of the planet's surface. 2 were atmospheric data. The remaining 3 were dedicated to the species itself, the dominant life form, bipedal, warm-blooded, remarkably fragile in construction, and according to the initial assessment of no significant strategic or scientific interest. We filed the report. We assigned a monitoring team. We moved on to other things. I was not part of the original team. I joined the program in its 47th year, fresh from the academy, assigned to what most of my colleagues considered a dead-end posting. Nobody wanted to spend years watching a primitive civilization argue with itself on a single, unremarkable planet. The humans were not doing anything interesting, according to the standing reports. They were fighting each other over territory. They were burning things for energy. Their fastest mode of transportation was still a metal tube filled with controlled explosions, and their communication technology, while impressive for a pre-warp species, was still fundamentally limited to the speed of light within their own system. My supervisor, a veteran researcher named Sane Vala who had been watching the humans since the program's second decade, greeted me on my first day with the kind of tired smile that people give when they are too polite to say you've made a terrible career choice. She told me the humans were interesting, in the way that bacteria are interesting. Technically alive, technically doing things, but not in any way that was going to change your life. She said I would spend my years here writing reports nobody read, watching a species slowly work through the same developmental stages every primitive civilization worked through, and that if I was very lucky, I might be around long enough to see them crack faster-than-light communication, which she estimated was still about 200 years away. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about almost everything. To be fair to Sane Vala, we all were. Every single researcher who ever worked on this program walked in with the same assumptions and walked out, eventually, with the same expression, that particular look of someone who has just realized they have been profoundly, completely, and somewhat embarrassingly wrong. My first observation shift was unremarkable. I watched a human city go about its day. I watched them move through their streets in their primitive vehicles. I watched them eat, argue, build things, tear other things down, and go to sleep. I wrote a report. The report said nothing of consequence. I filed it and went to bed myself, wondering if Sane Vala was right about the career choice. But then, on my third week, something happened that I still think about now, all these years later, something so small that I almost didn't flag it in my notes. Something that, in retrospect, was the first real sign of what these creatures actually were. There was a conflict, a small one by human standards. Two nations bordering each other on the western continent had been in dispute over a strip of land for the better part of a century. The dispute had turned violent, as human disputes often did, and there had been casualties on both sides. Standard, expected, entirely consistent with every other primitive civilization we had ever catalogued. What was not standard, what was not expected, what was entirely inconsistent with every other primitive civilization we had ever catalogued, was what happened next. A third nation, one that had no territorial claim in the dispute, no economic interest in the outcome, no historical connection to either of the warring parties, sent resources, food, medical supplies, personnel to help the wounded on both sides, not to gain advantage, not to secure a future alliance. Not because they were required to by any treaty or agreement, simply because there were people suffering and they had the ability to help, and they decided that was enough of a reason. I flagged it in my notes. Sane Vala told me it was an anomaly. She said every species did things like this occasionally, random acts of cooperation that looked altruistic on the surface, but always had some underlying strategic logic if you dug deep enough. She told me to keep watching and I would find the strategic logic. I kept watching. I never found it. The third nation gained nothing from what it did. It spent considerable resources. It took on political risk. And when the conflict finally ended and the two warring nations signed their peace agreement, the third nation wasn't even mentioned in the treaty. They had simply helped and then stepped back and gone home. I wrote a longer report this time. It was still filed without response. Years passed. I settled into the rhythm of the program. I watched the humans develop. They were, I will admit, genuinely fascinating in ways that had nothing to do with strategic threat assessment. They had a relationship with time that I found philosophically bewildering. They were acutely aware of their own mortality, individually short-lived compared to most spacefaring species, and yet this awareness seemed to drive them forward rather than paralyze them. They built things they knew they would never live to see completed. They planted trees whose shade they would never sit under. They wrote books for readers who hadn't been born yet. There was something in them that refused to be contained by the boundaries of a single lifetime, and I found it strange and beautiful and more than a little unsettling, though at the time I couldn't have told you why. In my 63rd year on the program, Vala retired. Her farewell speech was brief. She said she was proud of the work we had done, that the humans remained a stable and non-threatening civilization, and that she expected they would continue on their current developmental trajectory for at least another century and a half before anything truly noteworthy occurred. She left. I was promoted to lead researcher. And then, almost immediately, things began to change. Not because of my promotion. The timing was coincidental, but in the years following Vala's departure, the humans entered what I would later come to call their acceleration phase, a period of technological and social development so rapid that our standard reporting cycles became completely inadequate. We had been filing quarterly reports. We switched to monthly, then weekly. By my 80th year on the program, I was filing daily. The first thing that changed was their energy. They had been burning fossil fuels for the better part of 2 centuries, a dirty and inefficient process that was slowly poisoning their atmosphere. Every planetary civilization we had ever studied that reached this stage had one of 2 outcomes. Either they destroyed their atmosphere and died, or they were rescued by outside intervention before they could. The humans had a third outcome. They fixed it themselves, not quickly, not elegantly. Not without tremendous internal conflict and political struggle, but they fixed it. Within 60 years of the crisis becoming undeniable, they had transitioned the majority of their energy production to renewable sources. They did this without any outside help, without any advanced technology being handed to them, working only with what they could figure out on their own. Our atmospheric damage models had given them a 15% chance of survival. They survived. And then they had the audacity to start reversing the damage they had already done. The second thing that changed was their medicine. I had watched humans die of diseases for decades, watched them develop crude treatments, watched them struggle against biological enemies they could barely see. In my 89th year, they cracked genetic editing, not just reading their own genome, which they had done decades earlier, but actually rewriting it, correcting errors, eliminating hereditary diseases, engineering resistance to infections that had killed millions of their kind for thousands of years. The speed at which they moved from theoretical understanding to practical application was, by any objective measure, staggering. Our own civilization had taken 4 centuries to make the same journey. They did it in 11 years. 11 years from first successful gene edit to widespread medical application. I filed a report recommending we upgrade their development classification. The commission denied the request. They were still on one planet, still no faster-than-light capability. Still not a concern. I want to be fair to the commission. I understand, in retrospect, why they kept denying the reclassification requests. On paper, the humans were still exactly what the original survey had classified them as. They hadn't left their solar system. They hadn't made contact with any other species. They hadn't developed weapons technology beyond what they already had, and what they already had, while destructive by their own standards, was nothing compared to what a spacefaring civilization could field. Every metric the Commission used to evaluate threat potential pointed to the same conclusion: non-threatening, developing, worth monitoring but not worth worrying about. The problem was that none of those metrics measured the thing that actually mattered about the humans. They didn't measure adaptability. They didn't measure the speed at which this species could identify a problem and solve it. They didn't measure what happened when humans decided that something needed to be done. In my 102nd year on the program, the humans went to their moon again. They had been there before, briefly, in the early days of their space program, a remarkable achievement for the time that they had then largely abandoned for several decades due to political and economic factors. This time was different. This time they went a stay. They built a permanent research station, then a larger station, then a habitat, then a small but functional settlement. Within 20 years of the decision to return, there were 3,000 humans living permanently on their moon, mining resources, conducting experiments, and very deliberately using the moon as a stepping stone toward the rest of their solar system. I watched this happen with a feeling I can only describe as professional unease. There was a purposefulness to it that I found difficult to categorize. They weren't exploring randomly. They were building infrastructure. They were laying foundations. They were, it seemed to me, preparing for something much larger than a lunar settlement. And they were doing it with the patient, methodical determination of a species that had decided, collectively, that the universe was going to be theirs. My colleague at the time, a researcher named Porath who had joined the program 2 decades after me, disagreed with my assessment. She said I was projecting, reading intention into behavior that was simply the natural developmental progression of any technologically advancing civilization. She said the humans were doing what any species did when it reached this stage. She said there was nothing unusual here. We had long debates about it, Porath and I, in the quiet hours between observation shifts, and I was never able to fully convince her that what I was seeing was different in kind, not just in degree, from what we had seen in other civilizations. She had not been watching long enough. She had not seen, as I had, the consistency of it. The humans were not just advancing. They were advancing with intent. There was a direction to everything they did, even when the individual steps seemed disconnected or contradictory. Something in them was always oriented toward the horizon, always pointed outward, always reaching for the next thing. The moment that changed everything for me personally, the moment I stopped thinking of this as a routine observation assignment and started thinking of it as something I needed to take very seriously, came in my 127th year on the program. We had deployed a new generation of observation drones, more sophisticated than the previous models, better camouflaged, operating on frequencies we were confident the humans could not yet detect. One of these drones was positioned in high orbit above the planet's northern hemisphere, running a standard atmospheric survey. Routine, invisible, undetectable by any sensor technology the humans possessed, or so we believed. The drone transmitted its standard check-in signal at the appointed time, and then, 40 minutes later, transmitted an anomalous signal that took our analysis team 3 days to decode. What it was transmitting was a response. A signal had been directed at the drone, from the surface, on the exact frequency it operated on, a frequency that should have been completely outside the human's technological capability to detect or generate. We ran the analysis 6 times. The result was the same each time. The humans had found the drone, not by accident, not by some lucky scan. They had been specifically looking for something operating on that frequency, which meant they had somehow deduced the existence of something operating on that frequency, which meant they had figured out, through whatever combination of mathematics and observation and sheer stubborn intellectual effort, that they were being watched. They had not only figured it out. They had spent what our best estimate suggested was somewhere between 5 and 8 years quietly developing the capability to locate and identify the source. They had done all of this without telling anyone, without making any public announcement, without doing anything that would have triggered an alert in our monitoring systems. They had simply, quietly, and with extraordinary patience found us. I filed the most detailed report of my career that week. I laid out everything: the drone detection, the frequency analysis, the estimated timeline of human preparation, the implications for our continued presence in the system. I recommended immediate escalation to the highest threat classification in our registry. I recommended we convene an emergency session of the Commission. I recommended we seriously consider making contact on our terms before the humans decided to make contact on theirs. The Commission responded 2 weeks later. They thanked me for my thorough report. They noted that the humans had not taken any aggressive action. They noted that detecting a drone was not equivalent to possessing any actual offensive capability. They declined to escalate the threat classification. They suggested I take a rest period if I was finding the assignment stressful. I did not take a rest period. I kept watching, and what I watched over the following years was the humans doing exactly what I had feared they would do when they found the drone. They studied it. They reverse-engineered everything they could from the signals it was transmitting. They used what they learned to build better equipment of their own. They mapped the frequencies we used. They identified the orbital patterns of our other observation assets. They figured out, piece by piece, the shape and structure of the surveillance network we had built around their planet over the course of 3 centuries. And they did all of this in complete silence, sharing nothing publicly, making no announcements, giving us no indication that anything had changed. From the outside, looking at human public communications and official government statements, everything appeared entirely normal. They were still arguing about politics. They were still having economic disputes. They were still debating the great philosophical questions of their civilization. Meanwhile, in facilities they had constructed specifically for this purpose, a small and apparently very dedicated group of humans was quietly taking apart everything we had built and learning from every piece of it. Poreth came around in her 203rd year on the program. She filed her own reclassification request, independent of mine, after observing a series of human military exercises that she described in her report as, and I remember her exact words because I read them 3 times, demonstrating a tactical sophistication and adaptive capacity, inconsistent with any previous assessment of this species' defensive capabilities. The exercises she was referring to were ostensibly standard military training operations, but Poreth had been watching closely enough to notice what the official designation concealed. The humans were not practicing standard defensive formations. They were practicing responses to attack vectors that did not exist in any conflict scenario derived from their own historical warfare. They were practicing responses to attacks from above, from orbit, from multiple simultaneous directions using weapons that moved faster than any technology they had publicly acknowledged possessing. They were, in short, practicing for a war against a spacefaring enemy. They were practicing for a war against us. The Commission reclassified them after Poreth's report, not to the highest designation, as I had recommended, to a mid-level designation that still carried with it a fundamental assumption of manageable risk. The debate within the Commission, from what I was told by colleagues closer to the decision, centered on the same argument it always centered on. The humans were still on one planet. They still had no faster-than-light travel. They still had no confirmed knowledge of any other civilization. They were preparing for something they didn't even know for certain existed. The Commission, by a majority vote, decided that a species preparing for a hypothetical threat was not the same as a species that posed an actual threat. I disagreed. I put my disagreement in writing. I requested a formal review. The review upheld the Commission's decision. In my 261st year on the program, the humans achieved faster-than-light communication. Not travel, communication. They sent a signal from their solar system to a relay 0.4 light-years away and received a response in under 30 seconds. We had estimated this would take them another 140 years minimum. They did it in 42. I was not surprised. I had stopped being surprised by the humans roughly a century earlier. What surprised me, what I had genuinely not anticipated, was the content of the first message they sent through their new communication system. It was not a message to each other. It was not a test signal or a calibration transmission. It was a message directed outward, into the general galactic medium, on a frequency that, if you were familiar with how interstellar communication networks were structured, a frequency that a spacefaring civilization monitoring a primitive planet might use for routine data transmission. They sent it in 247 languages, including 17 that they had no business knowing existed, because those languages belonged to species they had never officially encountered. The message was short. I still remember it word for word, because I read it every day for the next 11 years, turning it over in my mind, thinking about what it meant and what it did not say and what it was deliberate. Telly leaving unsaid. It said, "We know you are there. We have known for some time. We are not concerned. We would like to talk when you are ready. There is no hurry. We have been patient this long. We can be patient a little longer. That was all. No demands, no threats. No indication of what they would do if we didn't respond. Just a statement of knowledge and an invitation. Calm, utterly calm." The calmness was the part that stayed with me. I had been watching these creatures for 261 years. I had watched them rage and grieve and celebrate and despair. I had watched them go to war and make peace and go to war again. I knew they were capable of every emotion in the register. The calmness of that message was not the calmness of a species that didn't care. It was the calmness of a species that had already decided how this was going to go and was simply waiting for the rest of the universe to catch up. The commission convened an emergency session. It lasted 6 weeks. Every argument that had been made over the previous 2 centuries was made again, louder, with more urgency, and with the added weight of a species that had now definitively demonstrated they knew we existed. There were those who argued for immediate contact, for transparency, for beginning a dialogue on terms we controlled while we still had the advantage of initiative. There were those who argued for withdrawal, for pulling all our assets out of the human system and pretending formally that we had never been there. There were those, a smaller group, who argued for something I will not describe in detail because I opposed it then and I oppose it now. Something that would have resolved the situation permanently, but would have required us to do something that no civilization worth the name should ever do to another. I argued, as I had always argued, that the humans were not a threat to be managed. They were a civilization to be respected, and that respect was overdue by approximately 300 years. The commission voted for a monitored withdrawal. They pulled the observation drones. They discontinued the active surveillance program. They formally closed the file that had been opened in the program's first year and had been growing ever since. I was given a commendation for my service and offered a position at the academy, teaching the next generation of researchers about xenosociological assessment methodology. I declined. I filed one more report, my last official communication as lead researcher of the Human Observation Program, a report that said, in its final paragraph, that the question was not whether humanity would eventually become a presence in the wider galactic community. The question was what kind of presence, and on what terms, and whether the galactic community would be smart enough to meet them as partners rather than waiting until meeting them as peers became the only option remaining. Nobody responded to that report either. They rarely did. But I kept thinking about the humans, even after the program officially ended, even after the files were archived and the commission moved on to other concerns. I thought about the third nation that had helped in a conflict it had no stake in. I thought about the researchers who had spent years quietly learning our frequencies without telling anyone. I thought about the message, calm and patient and utterly without aggression, that had announced to the wider galaxy that Earth's dominant species knew it was not alone and was not afraid. I thought about 300 years of assumptions, carefully constructed and methodically proven wrong, one observation report at a time. The human ambassador arrived at the Commission's headquarters 17 years after the message. She came alone. No fleet, no escort, no visible weapons of any kind, though by that point we had reason to suspect that what was visible and what was present were not always the same thing where humanity was concerned. She was a small woman by human standards, older, with the kind of face that had clearly spent a great deal of time thinking. She sat down across from the full commission, all 47 members, and she looked at them for a long moment without speaking, and in that silence I thought I understood something I had been trying to understand for 300 years. The patience was not an act. It was not strategy. It was not performance. It was simply who they were, this strange and improbable species on their unremarkable planet, who had looked up at the stars while they were still burning wood for heat and decided, in some collective and unspoken way, that the universe was going to have to deal with them eventually, and they could wait. She spoke for 40 minutes. I was not in the room. I was watching from the monitoring station, old habits being what they are, and I watched the commission members' faces as she talked, watched the careful diplomatic neutrality give way gradually to something more genuine, something I recognized from my own early years on the program, the particular expression of someone beginning to understand that their assumptions were wrong and trying to figure out how wrong. She did not make demands. She did not present an ultimatum. She did not reference, even obliquely, the 3 centuries of surveillance we had conducted without their consent, though she certainly knew about it and we certainly knew she knew. She talked about the future. She talked about what cooperation between civilizations could look like. She talked about the problems that no single species could solve alone and the advantages that came from facing those problems together. She made it sound reasonable. She made it sound, in fact, almost inevitable. After she finished, the commission chair asked her one question. He asked her what humanity wanted from this relationship. She thought about it for a moment, actually thought about it, and then she said, "The same thing we've always wanted. To understand what's out there. To be useful. To make things better than we found them." She paused and then she added, with a small smile that I had seen on human faces before and never quite been able to categorize, and maybe, eventually, to stop being watched without knowing it. The commission laughed. I think it was the first time I had ever heard the full commission laugh in the same moment. It was the laugh of people who had been caught, and who knew it, and who had decided that being caught was, on balance, acceptable. 3 years later, the formal partnership agreement was signed. I attended the ceremony as a civilian, my official capacity having ended with the program. I stood in the back of the hall and watched the human ambassador sign her name beside the commission chair's mark, and I thought about the survey drone's 11-page report, 6 pages of photographs, 2 of atmospheric data, 3 of a species deemed of no significant strategic or scientific interest. I thought about Sainvala's tired smile and her comparison to bacteria. I thought about every reclassification request I had filed, and every denial I had received, and every report that had been archived without response. I thought about a third nation sending food and medicine to a conflict that wasn't its problem, simply because people were suffering and help was possible. I thought about 300 years of watching a species that was always becoming something that none of us had been prepared for. We had studied them for 3 centuries. We had cataloged their conflicts and their achievements and their failures and their recoveries. We had watched them almost destroy themselves and watched them pull back from the edge and watched them do it again and pull back again, each time a little wiser, a little more careful, a little more aware of what they were capable of and what that capability required of them. We had written millions of words about them in reports that almost nobody read. And in all that time, with all that observation, we had somehow failed to notice the most important thing about them, the thing that the ambassador's small smile had made suddenly and completely clear. They had been watching us back, not just in the years after they found the drone, not just since they decoded our frequencies. They had been watching back in one way or another since the very beginning, since the first nights they lay on their backs and looked up at the stars and wondered what was looking down. We had thought we were the observers. We had been, the entire time, the observed. I went home after the ceremony. I sat for a long time doing nothing in particular. Then I took out the report I had written in my first year on the program, the one about the third nation and the aid convoy and the conflict it had no stake in, the report I had filed and never received a response to. I read it again. It was a short report, 3 pages. It described what I had seen accurately and completely. What it did not do, what I had not yet known how to do in my first year, was say what it meant. What it meant was this. Here was a species, barely out of its caves by galactic standards, that had already figured out something that civilizations thousands of years older than them still struggled with. That the suffering of strangers is a reason to act. That help given without expectation of return is not weakness but its own form of strength. That the boundaries drawn between us and them, between mine and yours, between my problem and not my problem, are always, in the end, negotiable. I had spent 300 years watching these creatures, and I had written about almost everything except the thing that mattered most. That they were, in ways both inconvenient and remarkable, exactly the kind of species the galaxy had needed for a very long time. We were not ready for them. We should have been. If we had been paying attention, really paying attention, we would have seen it coming from the first decade of the program. But we were looking for the wrong things, asking the wrong questions, measuring the wrong metrics. We were asking whether they were a threat. We should have been asking whether we were ready to be their neighbors. The answer, of course, was no. But humanity, it turned out, had also spent 300 years getting ready for us. And they are, if nothing else, a patient people.